I was working with a couple the other day, and as usual, I asked one of the partners to slow down and turn their thoughts inward and just notice what was coming up inside them. And they really struggled with this. They kept getting distracted, wanting to talk about their thoughts. They kept wanting to talk about what their partner was doing. And they struggled to just be able to sit in their own body long enough to notice what was happening inside. This is actually not unusual. Oftentimes, trauma survivors have a great deal of difficulty being able to just sit and notice what comes up, to sit in silence with no distractions and focus inward. And being able to sit in silence, being able to tolerate solitude is a very difficult thing for trauma survivors, in part because one of the symptoms of trauma is avoidance. They tend to avoid thoughts and feelings and sensations that may actually trigger their trauma. And while distraction is certainly a way of coping, in the long run, it leads to more problems, such as a breakdown in connection with ourselves, a breakdown in connection with a partner, and a breakdown in communication. If we aren't able to draw on our own feelings and sensations and put those into words, it limits our ability to be able to communicate our experience of what's happening with us in our relationships. So today, we're going to talk about the gift of silence and solitude. Welcome to Trauma-Free Relationship. I'm Tom Philp, your host. And as a therapist, I've spent over 10,000 hours helping couples work through the trauma so they can repair ruptures, heal their wounds, and communicate from a place of wholeness and connection. Let's get started. Okay, as I mentioned in the opening, we're going to talk about the gift of silence and solitude today. Something that often is very difficult for, I think, trauma survivors. I would even go so far as to say all of us, whether you've suffered from trauma or not, whether you have any old wounds you're struggling with or not. I think being able to sit in silence, being able to be in a solitude place, be by yourself, be your own company, so to speak, I think is difficult these days, period. There are so many distractions that are taking place. I think this is one of those gifts that feels more like a threat and a danger than it does something that is really healthy for us to do. So I want to try an experiment. I want you to get into a quiet place. Try to seclude yourself where there are not any distractions of any kind, because we're going to try an experiment. Now, if you're driving or if you're someplace where there is distraction, maybe you're listening at your office or in a carpool or whatever, then you may just want to stick a pin in this podcast and come back to it later. And that's certainly okay. You can always pull it back up and try it. And this isn't a long experiment. It's only going to last about 60 seconds. But I do want you to try to get into a place where you can be really quiet. And what I want you to do is to be able to turn your thoughts inward and focus on your body. During the time in which I'm going to be quiet, what do you notice coming up for you? Is there any kind of a feeling, sensation, any sort of a thought, a picture, an image that comes to mind, or an impulse that arises in you for the amount of time I'm going to be quiet? Now, when you notice something, I don't want you to judge it or try to change it or move away from it or anything like that. We're not going to judge anything that comes up. What I want us to try to do is see if we can't get a little bit of distance from it and just notice what might be happening inside of us so that we can be aware of what our body might be communicating to us. So again, whatever comes up, just be accepting of it and just get curious about, I wonder what this means, or I wonder what this might be a trailhead to, what might lie deeper down if I were to follow that. I don't necessarily want you to do that right now. I just want you to try to notice. So for the next 60 seconds, I am going to just be quiet, and I want you just to notice what comes up inside of you. Let's begin. Okay. That was 60 seconds. That was only 1 minute of silence. And so if you were doing this experiment, then you were in a quiet place where there were no distractions, and you yourself were quiet for a total of 60 seconds or 1 minute. I'm curious what your experience of that was. I'm curious the things that came up for you. I know myself, even though I try to do this, I try to have some solitude time, some time in silence, because I think our bodies are built for that. It's still, even 1 minute, still feels somewhat awkward. It still feels kind of unsettling, if you will. So some of the things you might have felt, some of these, not all, is numbness in terms of some sensations. So feeling maybe emotionally detached or disconnected from your body. So maybe when you were looking inward and wondering, looking for some kind of sensation, maybe it felt rather numb. Maybe it was more like disassociation. Maybe it felt like sort of being outside of your body or observing yourself sitting there in silence from a distance. Maybe there was some hypervigilance, maybe a heightened state of awareness and alertness, constantly scanning for potential threats. So maybe you felt yourself sort of kind of going into a little bit of fight or flight. Or maybe you noticed some physical sensations. These can vary widely, but it could be some muscle tension. Maybe you noticed a headache. Maybe you noticed a racing heart, a stomach ache, or even just some butterflies in your stomach. So any of those sensations might have arisen for you as you tried this experiment. Now, I would imagine possibly that some fears came up for you, maybe some fears of the unknown. So oftentimes silence can create space for intrusive thoughts and memories to surface. It can lead to some anxiety, as I mentioned, some fear of what might come up. Maybe there was some fear of being alone with your thoughts, that you tend to go to a darker place. Part of the symptom of trauma, one of them is that we tend to avoid. We tend to avoid silence because it brings up scary or disturbing thoughts and memories. Maybe there was a fear of losing control for you. Sitting in silence can be associated with vulnerability and a loss of control sometimes, which can be frightening for those who are having a trauma experience. Maybe you felt like some of your trauma was starting to get triggered a little bit. Things were coming up for you that were very uncomfortable. And of course, then there could be fear of judgment. Some trauma survivors may fear being judged or blamed for what happened to them. Maybe you felt yourself starting to attack yourself for whatever it was that was coming up. So Silence and solitude really are incredible gifts, and they're old gifts, if you will. They've been around for years. Many spiritual leaders of all faiths have touted the idea of spending time in silence and spending time in solitude. And I think there's a reason for that. We used to live in a world where there was more silence, there was more solitude, and I think it did something beneficial to us to be able to live in that kind of world. Not that there always weren't things going on or people didn't create their own busyness. I think they did, whether they were constantly foraging for food or whatever it might be. But at the same time, there was the ability for the human being to be able to sit in more silence and tolerate it, and to be able to have more solitude, to learn to be alone, and not be lonely in being alone, because I think those are two different things. Being alone is solitude. Being lonely is a subjective experience that you might feel even if you're in a crowd. So being alone and being lonely are two different things. So here's some ideas for you to how to build in more silence and more solitude into your routine, because as I've said, I really think it's beneficial for us as human beings. The way that we are built is we are not constantly built to go, to run the rat race and never have ways to replenish, to refill the bucket, to re-energize, whatever it is that allows us to tap into more reserves so that we can continue the work that we do. We can continue the work of not only our vocation, but continue the work of our families and our children, of being these roles of mother and father and brother and sister and mom and dad, and all the different connective roles that we have in our lives, best friend, confidant, whatever that might be. We are no good to others, and we cannot sit with others if our battery is constantly being drained. And so it is very important, I think, in our work, all kinds of work, and in all of our relationships, especially with our partner, to be able to be as replenished as possible so that we can tolerate more. The more we can expand our window of tolerance, and we can do that in part through silence and solitude, these two gifts I'm talking about. And when we do that, then we can give more. We can be there more. We can focus more on others and less on ourselves. So here's just some ideas of some routine you can try to build in that might help you cultivate more silence and solitude into your day. So, for example, a morning routine. Maybe you get up an extra 15 or 30 minutes earlier and you enjoy the quiet of the morning before the world awakens. So maybe you get up and you open a spiritual document that you enjoy reading, or maybe you just grab a nice cup of coffee or tea and you just sit in your favorite chair and you don't turn on the TV and you don't have a radio, or these days even a record player, since that's come back into fashion. You don't turn on anything. You just let yourself sit for 15 to 20 minutes and let your thoughts wander and notice what sensations come up. And you just let yourself sort of ease into the day and nurture a good cup of coffee or tea or whatever it is you drink, and let yourself be and have that be part of your routine. Mindful moments is another one. So you could dedicate this time to, as I said, meditation, prayer, journaling, or simply enjoying your favorite beverage. So, those are some ways that you could build it into the early routine. If you're commuting, if you have to get on a bus or a train or a car, maybe drive in silence, turn off the radio, maybe save my podcast, until later, till your evening commute home, whatever that may be. But you are allowing yourself and creating and cultivating just a little time of silence and solitude into your world. Same thing with public transport. Excuse me. Resist the urge to immediately reach for your iPods, your earphones, or whatever they may be, and instead allow yourself to maybe even just tune in to the sounds around you. If you're riding on a train, what does the click-clack of the wheels on the steel tracks sound like? What kind of voices can you tune into? The murmuring of those talking around you. But being more aware of your surroundings, or finding ways to even sort of just allow yourself to sit and focus on what is coming up inside you as you notice that can be very healthy, especially for trauma survivors. What about in the middle of the workday? Well, you might take some mini work breaks, maybe 5 or 10 minutes. Go to a quiet spot. Go to a spot in the stairwell or something like that, and just do some deep breathing and allow yourself to just find some silence and solitude in the middle of your day. Go to lunch by yourself. Instead of going to lunch with a big crowd or a favorite colleague or whatever it might be, how can you just go to lunch in a quiet place? Pack your lunch and go sit in a car and just be quiet in the car for an hour. So that's something you might be able to do in the middle of the day. What about like an evening routine? Maybe being able to come home at the end of the day and sit in silence and grab a favorite beverage, maybe a glass of wine or something that you enjoy, and just sit in silence, again, in your favorite chair or your favorite spot on the couch, and not turning on the TV or the news or immediately reaching for some other device that fills the noise space, but rather just being able to slow yourself down and take that time to notice what comes up inside you when you sit in silence and you give yourself some solitude. Or it could be before bedtime, creating a routine that allows you to relax before you go to bed. That might be taking 15 to 20 minutes and just sitting in the silence, as opposed to turning off the TV or listening to a podcast and then trying to roll over. Certainly, doom scrolling on your phone is not healthy for you right before you go to sleep. There's been some studies that have shown that the light from the phone or the tablet is actually not good. It energizes you more than it does relax you to get you ready to then turn off the lights and roll over. So just trying to break some of those habits, or we cultivate or are able to break into our routines a little more of the silence and solitude that are such gifts to our lives. So that's during the work week. What about the weekend? Well, I highly encourage getting out into nature. Nature, and there's been many studies that have shown, is very good for us to go out on a hike or to go walk in nature. It's very therapeutic. So spend some time in nature, whether it's a walk in the park or a hike in the woods or just simply sitting in your backyard. And don't be afraid to go by yourself. Now, with that said, I do want you to tell somebody where you're going, but you don't have to go with somebody. Maybe there's a park where it's fairly populated. You wouldn't need to give somebody a heads up. If something happened, there'd be plenty of people that would walk by and know where you are. But maybe you just go on a walk by yourself for half an hour, and maybe you just allow yourself to notice what comes up with your own thoughts when you're out walking and exercising by yourself. So silence and solitude, as I said, are very old disciplines that are purported as by many spiritual leaders and many faiths, and have been for centuries, which tells me that there's something really important about allowing ourselves to create more silence and more solitude into our day. I also know that this can be therapeutic and healing for trauma survivors. It can be a way for you to learn to recharge your batteries so that you can give more to your vocation and give more to those that you care about and that you love in your life. So I encourage you to build more silence and solitude into your daily routine. And I think that you will find that you'll be able to tap into a core self better and stay there longer and maybe experience less busyness, less anxiety, less depressed emotions, less trauma triggers as you practice this more and more and more in your life. Thank you so much for listening today. As always, I hope you found this beneficial. If you want to hear anything particular, feel free to reach out and let me know. And until next time, we'll talk to you then.
Thank you for listening to Trauma-Free Relationship, a podcast for the healing of attachment trauma. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, or our website at traumafreerelationship.com. Be sure to look for our next episode on your favorite streaming service.